So I'm going to talk about the paper that I just presented a month or so ago at the conference of the European Forum for Restorative Justice in Estonia, where I saw some of you at that event. It's called Expanding Restorative, and it's a sequel to Defining Restorative. I actually uh, wrote the paper while I was still president of the International Institute for Restorative Practices, uh, largely for operational purposes. I wanted to provide the staff and students of the Institute and our programs, model programs for troubled youth, Community Service Foundation and Bucksmont Academy, to also provide their staff and students with a clear definitional framework and explanations so that people could use those in improving their daily work. But since then, in the decades since, while we've seen the efficacy of restorative, demonstrated in a lot of settings, schools, workplaces, treatment settings, justice settings, there are societal problems on a much larger scale that would seem to benefit from an expanded approach to restorative practices. And so that's what this is all about. The restorative practices continuum was their original concept I used to try to show to folks who were talking in terms of restorative justice and formal processes, a way they could look at it on a wider basis. So the formal processes at the time were seen as victim offender mediation, family group conferencing, and restorative justice conferences. But actually, when Terry O'Connell, who developed the Restorative Justice Conference, came to visit us, our schools and group homes, he said, "Hey, you guys are doing a restorative conference all day long." And that was a revelation to us, but we were doing just that. We would use an informal strategy like an affective statement. You really hurt my feelings when you did that. Or an affective question. How do you think you affected John when you did that? To impromptu conferences where you could use those affective questions with a small group of people to process what happened. On groups or circles. I gave the example of a group that we used frequently with field trips with kids, which was a proactive method. So nothing had gone wrong yet, but you'd circle up the kids before we got on the bus and said, "So, what could possibly go wrong with this field trip today? And what commitments are you willing to make to ensure that it doesn't happen?" And it was amazing how a little consciousness raising improved the quality of the experience for everyone. So this continuum led to the social discipline window, where in trying to define what we meant by restorative, we began to talk about high control and high support, a balance of control and support being the basis for restorative. Uh, and the words to, with, not, and for were actually developed at a staff retreat where people were struggling to find a good way, because people would say, well, if I'm not being punitive, then I'm being permissive. Well, no. And so the idea of doing things with people instead of to them or for them, I then incorporated in what I called the fundamental hypothesis. Human beings are happier, more cooperative and productive, more likely to make positive changes in their behavior when those in positions of authority do things with rather than to or for. And in order to expand the restorative practice continuum, obviously we want to stick with that fundamental hypothesis. So the things that I'm adding beyond the formal conference to expand the continuum must absolutely meet the criteria of with rather than to or for. So community processing was developed by Anke Segers in the Netherlands. And the most famous story I know makes a great example. It was Sciensburg Hospital in Friesland, a region of the Netherlands, went bankrupt. Everybody was arguing with everybody, the doctors and the politicians and the hospital administrators, insurance companies, the public, and people were dismayed. They lost their major regional facility. So Anke was brought in to conduct a negotiation, and she insisted that it be the solution, that it not be recommendations given to uh, politicians to then decide. It was going to be decided by the people involved directly. And 2,300 people offered themselves as having a stake in it. And she sorted them. It took her about a month to sort them into 22 interest groups. And so hospital administrators, insurance company, et cetera. And when she ran the negotiation, there were 22 representatives in the room, and that was being live streamed actually to 16,000 people. So it was very transparent. But these representatives could leave the room to go see their constituents and then come back so they could react to things as they were happening. And the process was 14 hours long, a marathon negotiations. But at the end, there was a signed contract and the hospital reopened weeks later. A remarkable situation when it's rare that you find satisfying solutions to many of these things. So was it a with process? Absolutely, as with as you can get. Similarly, citizens' assemblies. A citizens' assembly is when you draw the participants by lottery, like a jury, from the general population to truly represent the interests of the citizens. And you bring them together to make decisions and deal with very difficult issues. A famous one is Ireland on a national basis that's been dealing with a whole bunch of issues that were stuck in their constitution, and politicians were afraid to touch them because they were so politically volatile. One, for example, abortion. And the Citizens Assembly of 100 people actually came up with a set of suggestions for changing and allowing a certain degree of abortion policy freedom compared to what they'd done before. And the citizens of Ireland supported in their recommendations in a referendum. Both parties approved it by, that is, the assembly and the voters approved it by about 68%. Again, a remarkable solution to an issue that nobody wanted to deal with because it was too politically hot, and that came to a remarkably high level of consensus. So again, a truly with process. Restorative processes, however, in contrast to more directive counseling, mediation, or judicial processes, are facilitative. The participants are responsible for the outcome, not the facilitator, who is responsible for the process only. Wisdom of crowds is a great concept from a great book. James Surowiecki was a financial writer for the New Yorker, and he wrote this book back in 2004. And interestingly, it was named Best Business Book of 2004 by both Forbes and Businessweek, two prominent publications in the United States. And essentially, his subtitle says, "Why the Many Are Smarter Than the Few," which in fact represents restorative practice in a larger sense, that these groups of kids or people dealing with their conflicts can actually do a better job than some singular meeting leader handing out their prescribed solutions. And the book starts, interestingly, with a story about Francis Galton, a famous British mathematician and scientist, who in 1906 came upon an ox weight guessing contest at a country fair in the UK. And he was fascinated. And in fact, he got the tickets. People paid for a ticket and wrote their guess down. He asked for them. They're now artifacts in the British Museum. But what he found was when you averaged the group, they exactly guessed the 1,198-pound weight of the ox. And they did better than any of the experts who we might have assumed would have guessed better. Well, the wisdom of the crowds isn't just about guessing, but it's a really interesting manifestation of what a large group of perspectives can do when brought together to make some sort of a decision or a judgment. But the more important thing is, how do you have good large group decision making? And my 5 takeaways from his book were these: an agreed upon process for turning individual judgments into a collective decision, timely access to reliable information, diverse perspectives, independence of judgment, decentralizing decision making. You must have these 5 things to have good large group decision making. So let's take a look at how our legislatures hold up to that criteria. Well, I'll speak for America because I know more about it. We can't even decide on how to choose the individuals. We can't agree on how to run elections. We fight about the process once we get everybody together, and the rules keep changing in the legislature. Reliable information in an era of fake news, and alternative facts. No, we can't agree on what's reliable information. Diverse perspectives. Well, if you take the average of all the legislators in all the legislatures in America, you find you have white male men over 50, mostly with professional degrees, usually law degrees. That is not a diverse population. Independence of judgment, decentralized decision-making. Political parties can't allow that. In fact, in America, they have an individual in every legislature in America, a party representative called the whip, whose job is to make sure that legislators stay with the party position and don't exercise any independence of judgment. What a shock that we're not making good decisions. So, blueprint for community. And this really is my most important new learning in recent years, is that all types of restorative practices, no matter how large or small, establish emotional bonds among the participants. There's a wonderful example of Oprah Winfrey, the American television celebrity and movie star, was given the opportunity to bring together a group of people, 9 Trump supporters, 9 Clinton supporters, for a TV show. And she brought them together about a year after the election in September 2017. And of course, they had some strong arguments, although in the setting of a restorative event, everybody stayed within bounds and behavior. But what was fascinating is when she went to revisit them some months later, most of them had become friends. They'd actually socialized together. One woman said, "I can't believe I'm friends with a Trump supporter." And Tompkins and Nathanson had it right. Human relationships are best when there is free expression of affect or emotion. We actually enjoy it. But you have to minimize the negative expression and maximize the positive, but always allowing for free expression. Well, how do legislatures do? Well, politicians are really good at that free expression of emotion. They're not so good at minimizing the negative expression. So, what problem are we trying to solve with restorative practices? What are we trying to restore? I'd like to offer an expanded definition. Historian Harari, in his best-selling book, Sapiens, argues that the most momentous social upheaval to ever befall humankind was the collapse of the family and the local community, and their replacement by the state and the market. So business and government are what Habermas calls the system. And in the system, we do what we do because we're paid to do it. In the life world, however, it's a network of relationships, and we do what we do because we care. So every time we run a family group conference and give a family an opportunity to make their own plan, and instead of having the social worker and the judge dictate a solution, we bring the life world into the system. Every time we run a workplace circle in the morning and people check in and how they're doing, and someone talks about, oh my God, I'm having a day and these are the problems, people will rally around that person during the day to support them. And the check-in circle is another example of how we bring the life world into the system. Restorative community is a new model that arises when you achieve a critical mass of restorative practices in a particular setting, so that it produces significant positive outcomes. The first time I experienced that was amazing. We'd hired Paul McCold, a researcher, to come and evaluate our schools and group homes, CSF and Bucksmont Academy. And over 8 years, from 2000 to 2008, with over almost 4,000 kids coming through, he found that we more than halved criminal reoffending. And significantly, the longer a child stayed in the restorative, he called it a restorative milieu or restorative community, the better their social values were. So I think that I realized that when you achieve a really intensely successful restorative community, the outcomes can be beyond our belief. In her book, Restorative Communities, Kara Bolton identified 3 essential elements of restorative community: a sense of belonging, a pathway to making decisions, and a sound process to resolve conflicts. They're all vital to the success of restorative community. Well, I came up with this stuff called 6 facets of a new reality: learning, governance, care, justice, enterprise, and spirit. And they're the learning, they're the needs of our society, and the collective needs. If we were to successfully meet them, we'd have a more successful society. I first thought of it as a map. So I'd been working heavily in learning. I'd like to be working in the area of governance for restorative practices. They can also be used as lenses. So Terry O'Connell, when he worked with a care agency, a senior citizens residence, he took a governance lens to look at their needs and developed circles and other mechanisms by which the residents of the facility could actually have a greater say in the daily schedule and in the activities and policies of that facility. When we do restorative justice in schools, we take a justice lens and look at learning needs. Finally, proximity to the life world. And I envisioned the life world as being at the core of the 6 facets of the new reality, and the system being the periphery. And in my own experience, I've worked largely at the outer edge of learning, where the system, closest to the system, with public schools, which do very little in the way of restorative values. There's very little with, and mostly to or for. The opinions of family and individual students are not terribly important to the process. Whereas my son Josh has worked for a number of years in a place called in Massachusetts, excuse me, called North Star Center for, excuse me, for self-directed teen learning for teens. And in that setting, they don't have to come. There are no tests. There are no requirements. Everything they do voluntarily. The family and kids make the decisions of what they're going to do, and they thrive in that setting. But he's been working in a setting that's much closer to the values of the life world. So I'm not going to go through the individual and describe these learning governance, just that, first of all, there are examples in the article, which I urge you to take a look at and read, but also that's what Josh and I will be doing over the coming months, is highlighting things in these various areas. For example, in September, we're planning an event. One of the guests of our webinar will be Linda Klugman, who's president of IRP, who just finished a new book, which I meant to have here to hold up, but anyway, it's called Heart Strong Work and How to Create Better Workplace Culture. How can we take restorative to enterprise needs and spirit, of course. So Elaine Spungen, some years ago, predicted a restorative revolution in the way we approach justice, transgression, punishment, crime, and everyday conflict among ordinary people. But she said it's not going to be utopia and peace and love for all, but what it represents is a fundamental shift in the collective understanding of what might be possible. And in terms of being heard and giving people voice, Terry O'Connell wrote to me recently, and I grabbed it to put in this paper. Our most fundamental human need is to be heard and understood, not to be right or wrong. The power of voice transcends the differences that individuals have in beliefs and opinions. So we've developed the Building a New Reality program to foster a revolution by conversation and to bring restorative practices to every level and every corner of society. And we thank you for coming along and joining us today. Thanks.